All righty, looks like we are running on Facebook and YouTube. Welcome, everyone. Happy Tuesday afternoon to you. Hope that you are someplace nice and warm on this very beautiful but very cold Tuesday afternoon here in Jackson, Tennessee. Wherever you might be at, thank you for joining us today. Hope that you have a Bible with you and you might join us in Judges chapter 3. That's where we're going to be at for our study today as we continue reading and walking through the story that is found within Judges. We began last week in looking through the first couple of chapters of Judges, looking at the setting for Judges, taking place, of course, after the passing of Joshua and the generation that came after him, how they quickly forgot about the Lord, did not know the Lord or the good things that he had done for them within this land. We noticed in those first couple of chapters the failures of the people, not only from a militaristic standpoint, where they failed to drive out those who were native to Canaan and yet who were pagans and poor influences on them. Not only did they fail to drive them out, they also failed religiously in the fact that they began to adopt their religious practices. And that's detailed for us in the first few verses of Judges chapter 3 that we'll read together in just a second. Judges chapter 3 verse 1 through 6 gives us a little synopsis of what we have seen in the book up to this point. Thank you for being here, though. Hope God will bless us as we look into this text, grow in our knowledge of his word, because we believe that if we grow in knowledge of his word, we have the greatest opportunities to grow in our trust in him for what he is, or for who he is, and what he has done for us. And that greater trust, of course, can lead to greater faith. I hope God will bless us in these efforts this afternoon. Joining me, as always, is my good friend, Alan Sinistring. Alan, it is good to see you today. Hope you're doing well. Looking forward to looking at these stories of Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into these very interesting characters, and especially, of course, Shamgar is the coolest of all of them there. But
without a doubt, unfortunately, we don't have very much in that story. But what that gives us opportunity for is to use our imaginations a little bit. And I'll tell you, the imagination that I have, just thinking about what Shamgar was doing, it's pretty cool, at least in my own mind. And I'm sure we all use our imaginations pretty well to think about him too. All right, let's go ahead and get into the text then. We're looking at 3 Judges today. And I want to remind us what we're seeing here within the book of Judges. Whenever we think of Judges, and we mentioned this, Alan, we often think of people with black robes sitting on a stand with a gavel in their hand making judgments. You think a judge simply makes judgments. Maybe brings to mind what we think of Moses doing while he was in the wilderness with the people of Israel. Remember, Jethro came to him and offered him some advice on how to judge better. We're actually going to see that in our next on about Deborah. We'll see her doing something similar to that. But with these first three men who serve in this position of judge, we see them being much more of what we suggested in that first study as we're doing an introduction into the judges. Then instead of seeing them in that courtroom type of sense, we see them instead in a savior type of sense, in a warrior type of sense. So they were often deliverers for God's people in a military context. And we're definitely going to see that on display within this first chapter, within this first section of the actual judges and their stories here in Judges chapter 3. But why do we need these judges? Why do we need these men to fulfill these particular roles for the people? Well, we're going to see that here in Judges chapter 3 and verses 1 through 6, where it is recorded for us that these are the nations the Lord left in order to test all those in Israel who had experienced none of the wars in Canaan. This was to teach the future generations of the Israelites how to fight in battle, especially those who had not fought before. These nations included the 5 rulers of the Philistines and all of the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites who lived in the Lebanese mountains from Mount Baal Hermon as far as the entrance to Hamath. The Lord left them to test Israel to determine if they would keep the Lord's command as he had given their fathers through Moses. But they settled among the Canaanites, Hethites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, meaning the Israelites did that. They settled among these people. And verse 6 says that the Israelites took their daughters as wives for themselves, gave their own daughters to their sons, and worshiped their gods. Alan, there's a word that appears, I believe, twice here within these first 6 verses that clues us into why the Lord had these people in these particular places? And what's that word that you see here? What does it mean that the Lord was doing this thing in regards to how the Israelites were going to begin this time of living within the land of Canaan?
Talk about test, I guess. Is that
Yeah, that testing word that causes people some problems. Why is it, Alan, that the Lord would want to provide opportunities for these people to fall? Whenever we think of tests, like a teacher giving us a test, we think of, well, the teacher wants to see how much we know. Is the Lord not aware of the character of this people? Is he not aware of how they would respond in this way? If that's not what is meant by test, what is meant here in this section, you think?
if we think about it, we that test word is kind of difficult, but it makes sense that God would leave some of these nations, that he wouldn't just wipe them all out and be done, and then the Israelites would have peace. Because what always happens when there is peace? Well, they tend to forget. They tend to grow fat, grow lazy, grow complacent, grow, all these things that come with wealth, prosperity, peace. But when there is constant war or constant struggle from generation to generation, then it's actually, even though the life might be more difficult, it's easier to pass down that remembrance of God and that remembrance of what they're supposed to be doing from generation to generation. So we might think of this as, why didn't God just, let them win, let them wipe out all the nations and then have peace? Well, I think God, in his infinite wisdom, knew that this was actually better for them to have to constantly work and struggle and because when we struggle, when we work like that, we appreciate better, and we come to love God more when there is a measure of work that comes from that. So I think that's his goal here. He's trying to not just give them peace, but he wants peace and prosperity and love and obedience. He wants all of those things. Well, some of those things can't come, or can be lost when there's too much peace. I think about the days of Solomon. They had as much peace and as much wealth and prosperity as is possible, and even Solomon himself, he had everything he needed. And so what happens? He turns to all of his wives. He turns to other gods. So even if we, that's a perfect example of what we our minds want for the Israelites and for ourselves, and what is the result of that? The same thing. So I think that's what's happening, at least in the Judges, and really, the nation of the history of Israel as a whole. There's not very much downtime, if you will. There's always something happening. Mm-hmm. And if there's prosperity, then they fall into this same cycle of abandoning God. So then he brings war and struggle for them, and then it's from that typically a better generation comes up that is a little bit more righteous. So it makes sense why God would do that, because he's trying to get as many people to be righteous as possible, and that can't really come when there's this peace. But that also gives us something to look forward to, that lasting peace that the book of Hebrews talks about. Joshua did not give them that Sabbath rest. We're looking forward to an actual rest where we don't have to struggle all the time, and that comes with God in heaven. But we can't really achieve that here, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think so much what you're saying is right there, nailing it on the head. If we go back just a couple of verses to chapter 2, in verse 22, we're given some greater commentary on what the Lord wanted to accomplish in these testings. I did this, Judges 2 and 22. I did this to test Israel to see whether or not they would keep the Lord's way by walking in it as their fathers had. Again, is it the Lord who wants to know? Well, no, the Lord knows. But who does he need to really prove the quality of the faith of Israel to? Well, it's Israel themselves. What you're saying is exactly right. I think if there is no struggle to struggle against, so there's nothing to show the true depth of our faith, if there is never the trial, never the temptation, then we're going to say, yeah, my faith is great. My faith is awesome. My faith cannot be destroyed. But it isn't until we actually face the trial or the struggle in which we can truly say whether that is the case or not. I believe what the Lord is doing here is showing them who they truly are, not showing himself, but allowing them to see the true health and strength of their faith, which unfortunately, what we see in this opening 6 verses, Alan, is that it was not very strong. They were unfaithful in the fact that they took the daughters of these Canaanites for themselves, and they gave their own daughters to their sons. And then it says that they worship their gods, which is exactly where we pick up in verse number 7 as we read about Othniel, the first judge, where you're giving that commentary in 3 through 6 about the state of Israel, why they were where they were, why God had done what they had done, what this had revealed about themselves. And that unfaithfulness is seen in verse number 7, that the Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot the Lord their God and worshiped the Baals and the Asherahs, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he sold them to King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim, and the Israelites served him 8 years. And the Israelites cried out to the Lord. And so the Lord raised up Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's youngest brother, as a deliverer to save the Israelites. And the Spirit of the Lord came on him, and he judged Israel. And Othniel went out to battle, and the Lord handed over King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram to him, so that Othniel overpowered him. And the land had peace for 40 years. And Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. We see here, Alan, and maybe you could pull up the kind of the crisscross visual that I sent you, just kind of show how the judges relate to one another. The structure of judges, as we see on the screen here, the judges themselves really line up well with judges who are going to come later on. You can line them up in a good way. So Othniel here is going to be similar to Samson in many ways, but similar maybe isn't the best word. Maybe contrasting is the better word to see here. Both of these individuals, the one, of course, Othniel begins the cycle of the judges. Samson's going to end the cycle of the judges, whereas we're going to see here in a minute from Othniel, he is going to be an outsider moving into Israel. We see Samson in many ways being an Israelite moving outside of Israel, becoming more of a Philistine. And I mentioned that here just to show kind of the connections between the differing judges and where they come in the cycle. And of course, we'll mention this again once we get to Samson. We'll do that throughout these studies, look at the connections we see between these individuals. But it all begins where we see that opening commentary ending, Alan, and it begins with the unfaithfulness of Israel, that they did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshiped the Baals and the Asherahs, and that caused God to do what God does whenever his people are unfaithful. He became extremely angry, and he set to punish them. And he did so through these nations that were around them, these pagan nations God used as a tool for them. As we look at this opening judge, Alan, Othniel, what do you see as really being maybe the main point that can be taken away from this particular judge in the history of the judges of Israel?
You mentioned, looking at this chart, how these some of these judges relate to each other. So we're kind of looking at a chiastic structure, which is common throughout the Bible.
That's the word I was looking for.
A, B, C, D, and then going backwards, D, C, B, A. So we have our first judge, Othniel, and our last judge, Samson, that are supposed to connect in some literary ways. And to me, the most obvious is just the mention of the Spirit of the Lord. We know that Samson often had the Spirit kind of come upon him, and that's when he performed these great feats of strength. Grabbing the gates and carrying them, miles, or defeating however many Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey or something. Well, here you have the same kind of thing happening with Othniel. He has the Spirit of the Lord in verse 10 coming upon him, and he went out and defeated this king. and overpowered him. So the the main thing to highlight with this chart right here is we're starting off pretty good. Like, we don't really know too much about Othniel, but he's married into a pretty good family. Obviously, Caleb was from the tribe of Judah. He's marries his Caleb's daughter. We already read about Othniel in chapter 1 and verse 13. So I'll go back up there just to highlight that. Chapter 12. Am I back on the? Yeah, I'm back on this. So chapter 1, verse 12, Caleb said, "Whoever attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer, I will give my daughter Achsah to him as wife." So Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's youngest brother, captured it, and Caleb gave his daughter Achsah to him as wife. So he's already, this makes sense that Caleb, or that Othniel, would be the first judge, and we're starting off pretty good here. He's a powerful king, or a powerful judge. He delivers the people. He has the Spirit of the Lord upon him. But getting back to that chart, I think the point is how, as each judge goes, they kind of progressively get worse.
Right.
And
so
then
that other chart, the little funnel one.
Oh yeah, I'll show that one to you. Let's see.
And this chart that's currently on the screen is from Kenneth Way's book, Judges and Ruth. You can find that on page 3 of this book. It's really, really helpful. And then this particular chart that I made, stole from a friend of Philip Martin. They had this on the screen. And so I made my own, which is not nearly as nice as the one that was originally made. I kind of fiddled around and was able to put this together a little bit, but it just shows, as Alan says. Actually, Alan, you just go ahead. You were saying this already. Thought you might throw it on the screen though.
Well, the cool thing about Judges, it's a very well put together literary work. It's not simply just a description of events. There's lots of connections, and specifically between these judges, and comparisons of the stories. So we'll see, like with Othniel, you have pretty good judge. Not much negative said about him, and then his counterpart Samson. Well, there's that same Spirit of the Lord is on him, but we know enough about the story of Samson that there's a lot of flaws there. Mm-hmm. So the point is, especially with this downward cycle of this chart, we're seeing that even the leaders of the people are getting progressively worse and worse. So even these great judges even Samson and Jephthah and Gideon, these guys are remembered into the New Testament as men of faith, but they are getting progressively worse and worse. And these stories that are kind of being retold in certain ways, they're going to get progressively worse. So we won't see it early on, but as we see those second halves coming up, Samson, we'll compare him to Othniel and see how much worse he is. And Jephthah, comparing him to Ehud and Shamgar, and comparing, seeing how much worse that judge is compared to the earlier judges. You kind of start to see that focus of the book is just this downward spiral all the way to the end, which is the epilogue here, which, spoiler alert, if you read ahead, this is probably the worst parts of the entire Bible is these last couple chapters of Judges. And compare that to the prologue, which, even that wasn't great, because they were starting this spiral, starting this decline spiritually. But at least they were still had some good things in that first chapter that we saw. But by the end of this book, the epilogue, chapter 17 and beyond, we're just at the very pit of despair, if you will, compared to the beginning. So that's something to keep in mind as we read each of these judges. Start to compare and think about the ones that their counterpart at the end of the book as well, and we'll look back at the first ones as we get to the end and see the decline in real time.
Right. Yeah. As we mentioned, we would often compare this judge of Othniel to that of Samson. And as I mentioned earlier, we see the reversal of those two individuals together. We see similarities, as you mentioned, Alan, the Spirit of the Lord being on both of them. And whenever you see Spirit, we often want to think, I think, on automatically of the Holy Spirit, and that being at play here. But it seems to be more so that this Spirit of the Lord coming upon him is simply a way that the Lord gave power and authority to these individuals in order to serve the purposes that he would have them to serve. Othniel here had this spirit where he would go out to battle and he fought and overpowered this particular king. In this instance, of course, Samson had the superhuman strength, which allowed him to overcome his enemies. But then we see the contrasting natures of them. Othniel here is, though he's counted among those who belong to the tribe of Judah, he's actually an Edomite. If we go to the genealogies that we often skip over in Genesis 36 and First Chronicles chapter 1, in both of those places we see this his father Kenaz mentioned here, and we can trace that back and find out that that's a descendant of Esau. So he's not a natural Israelite, but he's more of an adopted Israelite. He's a proselyte into this particular people. We have here the first of a number of instances where someone outside of Israel is actually used as the deliverer for Israel. And not only that, we also see people who we would not think would serve in very, very important roles in the Judges story end up serving very important roles. Here, Othniel, this Edomite, becomes an Israelite in a sense, in the fact that he's the one who delivers the people over to, or delivers his people, the people of God, from the enemies that they are being overcome by. And of course, that's exactly what was said would happen. If we go back to chapter 2 and verse 16, I should say, that the Lord raised up judges. And again, this prologue is giving detail of what we're going to see in the rest of the book of Judges. The Lord raised up judges who saved them from the power of their marauders, but they did not listen to their judges. Instead, they prostituted themselves with other gods, bowing down to them. They quickly turned away from their fathers who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. They did not do as their fathers did. And whenever the Lord raised up a judge for Israel, the Lord was with him and saved the people from the power of their enemies while the judge was still alive. And the Lord was moved to pity whenever they groaned because of those who were oppressing and afflicting them. And then whenever the judge died, the cycle would just begin again. And as you mentioned, Alan, it just got progressively worse. It was the cycle that was not, if they're level 8 bad, they didn't stay level 8 bad. They moved into level 9. And once they were at a level 9 bad, then they moved to level 10 bad, and it ends up where you talked about the very end of Judges, where it's just an absolute mess and a horrible situation for them to find themselves in. Which, if you're reading this for the first time, Alan, you're reading this first story of Othniel, you're thinking, okay, this isn't that bad. It's not too bad. We see the sin, of course. We see the deliverance, but this is really just your standard Judges story. If you were to say, well, give me just the plainest Judges story, I'd say Othniel would probably be the one that you would use to show that to be the case. God here showing his gracious mercy and delivering the people from their sin, from their oppression, because or through the means of a judge. But then we move. Do you have anything else on Othniel you want to share, Alan?
Just to highlight, you mentioned how Othniel was likely not a native Israelite. He was from the tribe or from the nation of Edom, Esau. But and we'll have this kind of repeat. Shamgar is likely not an Israelite, right. And you have all these others like Deborah. These are unlikely leaders. Well, why are so many of these judges not the typical leaders? Well, because the ones that should have been stepping up were not stepping up.
Right.
We'll see on Friday, Deborah and Barak is kind of combined in a story. It should have been Barak as the leader of Israel. He's actually an Israelite and he's a male. Well, his timidity, his lack of leadership left a vacuum that had to be filled by Deborah, and she had to step up, which kind of goes back to all the way. Really, that's these types of things go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, and how how Adam's lack of authority and leadership allowed Eve to kind of step in as and try to put herself above Adam, and that's obviously that turned into disaster. So so the same kind of thing happening here, not just a woman over a man, but just a non-Israelite over an Israelite. This is not what should be happening, but God is still using these people to help to deliver his people. But it just kind of highlights the level that they have fallen, like you mentioned, level 8, level 9. I mean, it's just getting worse and worse. And then a guy like Samson, who actually is an Israelite, well, what does he try to do? He pretty much tries to become a Philistine the whole time. He's always going off with Philistine women and hanging out with them, and he'd rather be a Philistine than be an Israelite. So this is, again, just a downward spiral for the nation as a whole, but all these individuals as well.
And speaking of things that are not as they should be, let's get into the story of Ehud. The Israelites, again, verse number 12, did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and he gave King Eglon of Moab power over Israel because they had done what was evil in the Lord's sight. And after Eglon convinced the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join forces with him, he attacked and defeated Israel into possession of the city of palms, which is Jericho. And the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he raised up Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed Benjamite, as a deliverer for them. And the Israelites sent him with the tribute for King Eglon of Moab. And Ehud himself made a double-edged sword 18 inches long, and he strapped it to his right thigh under his clothes, and brought the tribute to King Eglon of Moab, who was an extremely fat man. And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had carried it. And at the carved image near Gilgal, he returned and said, King Eglon, I have a secret message for you. And the king said, silence, and all of his attendants left him. Then Ehud approached him while he was sitting alone in his upstairs room where it was cool. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And the king stood up from his throne, and Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it in Eglon's belly. And even the handle went in after the blade, and Eglon's fat closed in over it, so that Ehud did not withdraw the sword from his belly, and the waist came out. Then Ehud escaped by way of the porch, closing and locking the doors of the upstairs room behind him. And Ehud was gone when Eglon's servants came in, and they looked and found the doors of the upstairs room locked, and thought he was relieving himself in the cool room. The servants waited until they became embarrassed and saw that he still had not opened the doors to the upstairs room. So they took the keys and opened the doors, and there was their Lord lying dead on the floor. And Ehud escaped while the servants waited, and he passed the Jordan near the carved images, the idols, and reached Sarah. And after he arrived, he sounded the ram's horn throughout the hill country Ephraim. And the Israelites came down with him from the hill country, and he became their leader. He told them, follow me, because the Lord has handed over your enemies, the Moabites, to you. So they followed him, captured the fords of the Jordan leading to Moab, and did not allow anyone to cross over. And at that time, they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all stout and able-bodied men, and not one of them escaped. Moab became subject to Israel that day, and the land had peace for 80 years. Al, whenever I think about people saying that the Bible's a boring read, I'm thinking they have not read Judges chapter 3. That they have not read the story of Ehud, and this assassin is really who he is. He is an undercover assassin from the tribe of Benjamin, and really just exciting, captivating story we have here. Again, it's one of those stories that we like to tell in our kids' classes, which is kind of crazy that we would tell this story in our kids' classes, but it's just kind of easy for them to imagine just what's going on here with the whole left-handed thing and the girth of Eglon. Apparently, it's just it's one of those things that sticks in their minds, and that think about it. It helps bring really the story of the Bible to life for them. But as I mentioned, this everything about this story almost is there's deception on so many levels. There is there's things are not as they ought to be, which begins, of course, with where these Judges stories always begin, really, which is the Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. And we see that because of that, the Lord gave Eglon of Moab power over Israel. Alan, that certainly is not how things should have been. And yet there were some things that, again, Israel should have done that they didn't do that gave this whole situation the opportunity to be brought forth. What do you see here within the story of Ehud that just continues to progress this cycle of the judges within this story?
Well, it's just disappointing. Like, talking about the city of palms. This is Jericho, the very first city that was so soundly defeated back in the book of Joshua. Well, they've lost possession of it, and they've allowed this King Eglon to come in. And I noticed there's a progression in these years with the first guy, Cushan Rishathaim. I think they served him 8 years. Well, now look at Eglon. They're serving him for 18 years. So this is getting worse. Their punishments, at least the time frame, is getting worse and worse. And then there's just a lot of fun kind of wordplay going on with the story, which, Ehud is a left-handed Benjamite, which the name Benjamin means son of my right hand. So he's a left-handed right-hander, which we always consider him, the number one, like, southpaw. He's only left-handed. Probably he's actually ambidextrous. And like you mentioned, he was basically an assassin, which is because he has this sword. He's able to basically connive his way in and defeat Ehud, which it's also kind of funny too that this big guy has grown fat on the tribute of Israel, and to the point that he's not even scared of Ehud. He allows everyone. He's so high in himself. He wants to hear this message. He tells all of his people to leave. He's not worried. He's for his own safety at all. Clearly, they didn't even check Ehud. Pat him down for a weapon of any kind. Which,
or
if they did, they
would probably go for the left leg, because most people are right-handed.
Yeah.
So pat that left leg. Go, hey, nothing's there. We're probably good to go.
So that shows that they weren't very thorough, or they weren't worried about these Israelites, or obviously worried about God in any way. There's also some fun kind of wordplay going on with, when he's stabbed and it talks about his entrails, or his waist comes out. Well, what happens a few sentences later? The servants are thinking that he's in his room relieving himself. So that the irony is, yes, his waist was coming out of his body, but not in the way that they expected. It was coming out because he'd been stabbed and killed. So just all sorts of kind of literary fun happening with this story. But then just, some kind of some sad things as well. Verse 26, he passed the Jordan near the carved images. What are carved images doing in Israel? They should not be there. Kind of some more allusions to Jericho again. The ram's horn. He sounds the ram's horn. Well, what did the Israelites blow for the walls to come down originally? It was that ram's horn. So just kind of some reminders of what once was, and how far things have fallen up to this point now that Jericho has been retaken. But some good comes out of it, because whereas before Othniel, the land had peace for 40 years, now we have land peace for 80 years. And it is good to remember that these are not all necessarily chronological, like one happens after the other. A lot of these would overlap, and these are very much, these are regional guys. So when it's talking about the land had peace, we're not talking about the entire land of Israel had peace. It was probably just this part of Israel had peace. So, while Othniel is delivering one part of Israel, Ehud might have been overlapped with him, and then Shamgar. So all of these doesn't necessarily mean it was one after the other. There was some overlap in obviously some regional times where they might have been going at the same time.
Right. Yeah. If all this is happening in and around Jericho, then it would have been more in the central area of Israel, and then over eastern trans Jordan, the eastern portion of Israel, which is why uh, we say that these weren't necessarily happening one after the other. Once we get on Friday into Deborah and Barak, we're going to see in the story, or excuse me, in the song of Deborah in chapter 5, it talks about what happens with her happened during the days of Shamgar as he's doing his thing in Israel. So there were some contemporary judges doing their thing in various parts of Israel around the same time. So these are not, whenever we read this, we would expect this to be in chronological order, that first Othniel happened, his 40 years are over, then there's Ehud with his 80 years, and then there's Shamgar, and then there's Deborah, Barak, and all this stuff. But that's just not how it worked for the writing of this book. Instead, we can see them being contemporaries with one another. And yet what is common throughout all of these stories, Alan, is the Lord being the one who brings all this about. Whenever the people sinned, it was the Lord who would raise up the king of a pagan nation in order to oppress them. And whenever the people cried out, and I'm not convinced that whenever the people cried out to the Lord, that was exactly repentance that was taking place. It might have been more that they were just upset that they were being oppressed, and God in his incredible grace and mercy would be sending these Israelites to them. If it was legitimate repentance, it was very short-lived repentance, because we can see again as they fall back into the same cycle again. But it's the Lord who raised up the pagans to afflict them. Then the Lord would raise up the judge to save them. And in both of these first two instances of these judges, we see in verse number 10 that it was the Spirit of the Lord that came on Othniel, and he judged Israel. He was God was the one who handed the king over to him. He was the one who gave Othniel the power in order to overtake the king of Aram. And then here with Ehud, we see Ehud even admitting that in verse 28. Follow me. Why? Because I'm strong and I'm mighty, and I'll lead you. No, follow me, because the Lord has handed over your enemies, the Moabites, to you. The Lord is certainly the central key theme in all of these judges stories. If anything was accomplished, it was by what the Lord provided in some way, shape, or form. These individuals are simply the tools by which the Lord carried out his plan in these particular stories. And then that brings us, Alan, to one of what's often known as the minor judges, just simply because there's not very much information given about him, which is Shamgar. In verse 3 and 1, after Ehud, Shamgar, the son of Anath, became judge and delivered Israel, striking down 600 Philistines with a cattle prod. We might, as I mentioned, we might wish there was more information here concerning Shamgar, but it does allow us to kind of imagine what that was like, him going about and bringing judgment against the Philistines. They were certainly very wicked people, a pagan people. What's interesting about the Philistines we might not know is that they weren't native to Canaan, that they would have come from the island of Crete, I think is what I read. They would have come across the Mediterranean Sea and settled along the coastline, and that's where that's the origins of them, not there in Canaan, but they were certainly a thorn in the side of the people of Israel for a very long time. And their worst nightmare was Shamgar. This, again, probably a non-Israelite individual who judged, in a sense, the Philistines through his striking down of a number of their warriors. Alan, what do you have about Shamgar? What do you have, just to go ahead and wrap up this chapter for us as we close out our study for today?
Well, with Ehud, but definitely more Shamgar, it's interesting. We're going to see very interesting items used to judge. So a cattle prod isn't necessarily the weapon of choice of a strong warrior, but and we'll see next story is going to be a tent peg, or down the road the jawbone of a donkey. I mean, these are not things that would strike fear in the hearts of a warrior, but when these seemingly harmless items are combined with the might and the Spirit of God, well, notice what happens. 600 Philistines can be killed. So I think that's on purpose to show that this is this is clearly not by Shamgar's amazing, ninja skills with a cattle prod that he was able to do this. This is obviously, the Lord using him to deliver Israel. And all of these so far, like you mentioned, we're not looking at judges in the same sense of the word that we understand. I mean, these are basically just war heroes, warriors. I mean, they're almost all of the judges we'll see, except for maybe Deborah, they do little judging. They just do lots of killing. So that's kind of the sense that we see with this word judge. But Shamgar's listed among them, even though he gets one verse and he gets talked about in chapter 5 as well. But I think I remember reading in one commentator that this word Shamgar is not typically an Israelite name. So he's likely not a native Israelite as well, like Othniel. So again, someone from outside Israel that God is using to deliver Israel, because there was no one there to step up at the time. So it gives you more insight into the state of the nation at the time.
Yeah, that's a great point that you're bringing up. I think that's really, really well stated and really needed for us to understand what's going on in Judges, that there was no one from within Israel itself that could really rise up and be that deliverer, be that tool for the Lord, because there was so much wickedness that abounded within the land. At least there was no one who we might think would be the people to step up and to be those deliverers. On Friday, hope you'll join us for that study as we look at chapter 4 and chapter 5 concerning the story of Deborah and Barak, that here we have a woman who is serving in this position of judge for Israel, serving a very vital role. And she calls Barak and says, hey, you need to be the leader. He's like, I don't know. I'll only go if you go with me, which we're going to get into all that, but just shows that the Lord is able to use anyone, really able to use anyone in order to carry out his purposes. And there's also, I think, some foreshadowing here, the fact that all nations are going to be able to flow into Israel and be a part of God's people through the work of the Messiah and the Christ. And of course, that's something we might talk about later on down the line. But if you don't have anything else, Alan, we appreciate everybody joining us today. Hope this has been a beneficial study for you. If you've never read this portion of the Bible before in the Judges, I hope that it has been good for you to learn about them today. Think about the stories that we've seen within these texts. For me, as I leave chapter 3, I'm thinking entirely about God and how God is going to work out his purpose and plan through anyone who is willing to be used, that his grace is incredible, that even though these people are always falling into the pits of idolatry and spiritual unfaithfulness, God's grace and mercy abounds because of that covenant that he has made with them, that they would be his people. And even though they continue to reject him, he reaches out to them and he delivers them in his mercy. And that ought to give us encouragement that even whenever we fall and stumble short, that God is ready to lift us back up, to forgive us, and to set us back in the place that we ought to be. And that ought to motivate us moving forward to not be unfaithful towards such a gracious God. Again, thank you for joining us today. Hope that you'll join us again on Friday for this study here on Facebook and YouTube. And if you're looking for some group of God's people to study with tomorrow night, we invite you to join us here at the Church House, 384 Pleasant Plains Road. We're going to be going through another study in the Minor Prophets, and I don't know which one. I don't know where my particular book is. Let's see here. I wonder who would we have this. Let's see. I can pull that up real fast. On the docket, we have Malachi. Malachi is going to be the Minor Prophet we'll be studying tomorrow night. Feel free to join us 7 p.m. in person, or you can join us again here on Facebook and YouTube for that study. Thank you so much for being with us. So may God bless you as you go throughout the rest of this day. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to help you as best we can. But thank you for joining us. Have a good one. And we'll see you next time as we continue our walk through history. Everybody take care.